We're here today to call for the CPS funding block grant bill to be called for a vote, be released from assignments. I'm the appropriations spokesperson for the education side of the Senate. And last week we had our appropriate committee with Gary Chico and Chris Cook from the State Board of Education. And we learned there's over $500 million in backlogged payments to our schools in Illinois. But yet, the Chicago Public Schools gets $230 million off the top before one penny goes to any other school district or school kid in Illinois. During that hearing, it came out that the recently released Chicago Board of Education Inspector General's report for 2013 has documented rampant waste, fraud, and abuse within the Chicago public school system. So we're not paying our kids on time in school districts all over Illinois, $500 million, yet they're getting $230 million off the top and then have a pattern and practice of waste, fraud, and abuse. What am I talking about? In some cases, they outright faked data. They created ghost students with an end game of drawing down more and more money from the state taxpayers and away from the school districts and the school kids outside of Illinois. I want to turn it over now to Senator Pam Altoff, who is sponsoring Senate Bill 2617, which is part of the agreed EFAC bipartisan report.
Good morning, afternoon actually. 2 years ago, I suspected that the Chicago Public Schools were receiving a disproportionate amount of funding through the Early Childhood Education Block Grant. I filed Senate Bill 1742 to address these suspicions. One of my strongest supporters during the process of this legislation was Senator James Meeks. To give you guys a little bit of a background about why something like this would be important to me, I graduated in 1971 from Illinois State University with a degree in special education, and in 1975 with a master's degree from Northeastern Illinois University with a degree in special education, master's. This legislation required all school districts, including CPS, to report on its use of early childhood education block grant monies. As a result of that bill, which did become law, the Illinois State Board of Education was able to analyze what CPS would have received in state funding if there was no fixed percentage from the Chicago block grant. The results, as you may have expected, were astounding. For the 2012-2013 school year, CPS received $230 million, or nearly double what they would have received if they had been reimbursed like all other school districts in the state. Clearly, the percentages used in the Chicago block grant are outdated and resulted in an unfair distribution of limited state resources. In January, the Bipartisan Education Funding Advisory Committee released their report after months of public testimony and studying the preschool through 12th grade education funding system. One of their recommendations based on this information called for the elimination of the Chicago block grant. Remember, this block grant is a separate funding stream granted to Chicago Public Schools, which allows the school district to bypass funding formulas used for all other school districts in the state. This special provision benefits CPS schools at the expense of downstate and suburban school children. Elimination of the block grant would mean that the Chicago Public School District would need to qualify for funding just like every other single district does. I filed Senate Bill 2617 in response to that report obtained from ISB in November of last year. My legislation mirrors, or maybe I should state it, that the recommendation of the Bipartisan Education Funding Advisory Committee mirrors my legislation. It requires the Chicago Public School to submit expenditures by program, populations, and service levels in the same manner as all other school districts for reimbursement. Unfortunately, it's been sent to the Education Subcommittee, which is where all bills go to die. It is frustrating when we have to explain to our school districts that they are going to have to spend another year struggling to come up with ways to fund their schools when Chicago Public Schools are bypassing the funding formula and receiving extra funding from the state. Even more frustrating is the fact that the extra money they are receiving is riddled with, as you just heard, waste, fraud, and abuse. It is clear as day that the block grant is unfair to children around the state, and it's a shame to see money wasted in this way and at the expense of other school districts and ultimately the children of the state of Illinois. Most of all, there needs to be an accountability across the board fairness as to how we are funding our educational system.
We're going to have Senator LaHood speak next. Before he comes up, I would point out that he's a former assistant U.S. attorney.
Well, thank you, Senator Rose. Darren LaHood, State Senator, 37th District from the Peoria area. And when you read this report from the Inspector General of CPS, and you see in the summary here indications like identified significant deficiencies in the internal controls, detrimental employee misconduct, falsified invoices, creating of fake vendors, diverting money into private bank accounts, and that's just in the summary, but that's what's in the report. And normally, when you would read something like this, the immediate reaction from the legislature would be, let's schedule a hearing on this, let's review this, let's have the board from CPS come down and have a thorough vetting of what happened here and what's in this report. That hasn't happened. And so when you look at the allegations here and what's put forth, and let's remember, there's lots of politics in this building, but this report is from a nonpartisan, independent Inspector General. That's who put out this report, not Republicans. So this is a report that's out there. We should have a full vetting of what's in this report, have the administration of CPS down here talking about taxpayer money. We're talking about this block grant that, again, we believe disproportionately goes to Chicago. And in the meantime, downstate schools in my district and many other districts are getting shortchanged. And so we are asking that Senator Althoff's bill be brought out of subcommittee, and we have a full hearing on this to get some answers on the allegations that are in this report. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Dale Ryder. I'm State Senator from the 55th District of Illinois, which includes all our parts of 14 counties in east central and southeastern Illinois, and I am proud to join my colleagues here to talk about what is obviously a very troubling issue. But as much as we want to talk about the Inspector General's report that's before us, we need to remember that this happens against the backdrop of other issues. It happens against the backdrop of the Democrat leaders here in the Capitol and their growing theme that the status quo is appropriate and required, that there's nothing we can do to make these programs more efficient, that there's nothing that we can do to cut wasteful spending or spending that is just flat out wrong, which is exactly what the Inspector General's report tells us. That there's, against the backdrop of last week, the Auditor General comes out with a scathing report that has already been the subject of investigations by news media, and we believe will be the investigation of other branches of government, such as law enforcement, with regards to the somewhere between $50 and $100 million of money that was put through a program called the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative, and really just disappeared into areas in the city of Chicago. And now we have before us an Inspector General's report that tells us that there were fake vendors, that there was the manufacture of students that didn't really exist in order to draw more state taxpayer dollars. And remember that there are school districts out there now that are owed about $505 million. Now, the school districts in my Senate district are owed about $5 million of that. But if you go to the school district in Carmi, or Lawrenceville, or Mattoon, or Marshall, they're going to tell you they are barely getting by. Between the change in emphasis on what matters in this state, away from education, which is what we've seen in the last decade, and the changes in formulas that have driven more of that money that's available for public education into Chicago and away from the rural areas, they're barely getting by. And now they will sit and look at an Inspector General's report that says that there was fraud, rampant fraud, going on in the Chicago public school system, and that they are getting additional $200-some million that these schools are not getting. That's a horrible message for government, regardless of the party that's in charge, to send. The Democrat leaders need to step up to the plate here. They need to take action on following up on the Inspector General's report, have committee hearings, and find out what really happened here. And they need to step up to the plate and tell the rest of the school districts in the state that they are just as important, and the kids who go to school in those districts are just as important as the one getting the Chicago block grant, and eliminate that block grant this session.
Thank you, Senator Ryder. As many of you know, Senator Ryder is also a former prosecutor, as am I, Senior Assistant State's Attorney for Champaign County. Look, we've included in your packets the data of what's owed to the various school districts in Illinois. It is absolutely irresponsible, and when you have the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative a few weeks ago, then last week's Education Committee, where this Inspector General report came to light, they're getting $230 million off the top before one penny goes to a kid in another district, any other district in Illinois. Just one example, they drew down hundreds of thousands of dollars through fake enrolling students that didn't exist. Last week, the State Board of Education Chairman, Gary Chico, who's a Democrat, and a pretty prominent Democrat at that, told us, and I quote, in our committee, "I don't think our wallet is matching our priority when it comes to education." We couldn't agree more. The fact is, after 12 years of Democrat control of the state of Illinois, their priorities are not in K-12 education. That is a bottom line. One fair thing to do would be to get this block grant bill of Senator Althoff's released and passed and signed into law. It shouldn't matter where you go to school. Every school kid should be treated the same. And unfortunately, with this kind of a pattern and practice of waste, fraud, and abuse, it's the school kids outside of CPS who suffer. Take any questions you have. Yeah, and in fact, in some cases, these have been turned over to criminal authorities. There are a couple convictions, but I think, personally, from my perspective, I'd like to have some folks from the Chicago Public School Board come down here and testify and talk about this. I mean, another angle, and most of you know I've been pretty hot to trot over the years on welfare fraud. There's an entire scheme in here to defraud the free and reduced lunch program.
I would just comment on that, Terry. If you look in the report on page 3 of the inspector, they talk about this report working in conjunction with federal and local law enforcement and prosecutorial authorities to investigate and prosecute things that come about. That would be a good question to ask and find out about where in the process of those investigations, or what have they turned over to authorities, so we can find out more on that.
You're watching the Illinois Channel.